chest clung to the rows of white crosses like a shroud, each marker a silent testament to lives cut short in the name of freedom. An elderly man, his dark skin weathered by 8 decades of living, knelt before one particular headstone with trembling hands. James Ryan, once a young private from Iowa, now carried the weight of 75 years since that fateful day. His fingers traced the engraved letters, spelling out Clinton Barris, and tears that had waited a lifetime finally found their release. The medal he placed upon the cold stone caught the morning light, gleaming like a promise kept too late. Time folded backward, the cemetery dissolving into the chaos of June 6, 1944. The English Channel churned gray and violent, beneath landing craft packed with men who would either become heroes or statistics. Among the sea of white faces, cramped in those steel coffins cutting through the waves, stood one figure who commanded attention not through his rank alone, but through the sheer impossibility of his presence. Captain Clinton Barris gripped the edge of the landing craft, his dark hands steady despite the artillery shells exploding fountains of seawater around them. The men nearby shot glances his way, some curious, others hostile, most simply bewildered. A black officer leading white soldiers into the mouth of hell itself was not something their America had prepared them for. The ramp dropped, and Barris was the first to charge into the storm of metal and sand that was Omaha Beach. Behind him, men hesitated for a fraction of a second, that eternal moment between following a leader they had been taught to distrust and facing death alone. Then young Private Otis Duane, barely old enough to shave, stumbled forward after the captain. And the spell broke. They all surged forward into history, their prejudices temporarily drowned by the more immediate concern of German machine gun fire cutting men down like wheat before a scythe. Clinton Barris had not always been a soldier. Just 3 years earlier, he had stood before a classroom at a small Illinois college, teaching the battles of antiquity to students who could never have imagined they would soon be living their own chapter in history. His voice had carried the same authority then, explaining how Hannibal crossed the Alps, or how Alexander conquered the known world. The students, all white save for 2, had listened with varying degrees of attention, unaware that their professor would soon be leading men not much younger than themselves, through battles that would make ancient warfare seem almost civilized by comparison. The path from professor to captain had not been one Barris chose willingly. When Pearl Harbor shattered America's isolation, he had tried to enlist like millions of others, driven by the same patriotic fervor that swept the nation. But the recruiting office had taken one look at his skin and suggested he might better serve in the motor pool or the mess hall. It had taken letters from his university president, his published papers on military strategy, and finally the intervention of a senator who owed his father a favor from decades past to secure him a commission. Even then, he was meant to be relegated to training camps, stateside, teaching map reading to white officers who would command black service units. The cosmic joke of bureaucratic error that landed him with a combat command would have been amusing if it had not placed him directly in the path of history's bloodiest conflict. Sergeant Carter Elias watched the captain from 20 feet away as they pressed forward through the beach obstacles. Elias had seen enough officers in his 40 years to recognize the real from the pretenders, and something about Barris gnawed at him. Not the color of his skin, though that certainly added to his unease, but the way the man moved through the chaos with a purpose that seemed almost supernatural. Elias had worked the shipyards of Brooklyn before the war, had broken strikes and broken heads when the money was right, and he knew how to read men. Barris moved like someone who had already accepted death and therefore had nothing left to fear. The translator, Private Otis Duane, vomited behind a tank trap, his body rebelling against the sensory assault of his first combat. The smell of cordite and blood, the screams of the wounded, the sight of bodies floating in the surf, some missing limbs, others missing faces. He had studied French and German at Columbia, had dreams of being a diplomat after the war, building bridges between nations with words instead of destroying them with bullets. Now he cowered behind steel and concrete, trying to remember how to breathe while men died around him in languages he was supposed to understand, but which all sounded the same when filtered through agony. It was Barris who pulled him forward. Not roughly, but with a firmness that brooked no argument. The captain's eyes, brown and deep as turned earth, held no judgment, only an understanding that transcended words. They said a soldier's first battle determined whether he would break or become something harder. Otis felt himself at that crossroads, teetering between dissolution and transformation, and it was Barris's steady hand that tipped the balance. By the time they had secured their section of the beach, 3 men from their unit were dead, their bodies covered with ponchos and marked for graves registration. Barris knelt beside each one, removing their dog tags with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with the violence that had just transpired. He did not know these men, had only met them hours before during the briefing on the ship, but he treated their remains with a reverence that made even the most prejudiced among the survivors take notice. The mission briefing came that evening in a commandeered farmhouse 5 miles inland. The space still smelled of the French family who had fled, leaving behind half-eaten meals and family photographs that seemed to judge the intruders from their frames. General Raymond Morrison, a man whose ancestry traced back to Confederate generals, delivered the news with a mixture of military precision and barely concealed distaste at having to address Barris directly. 3 brothers from Iowa had died within a week of each other. One at Anzio, his destroyer split in half by a German torpedo. Another in the Pacific, shot down over the Coral Sea. The third had jumped into Normandy with the 82nd Airborne and had been found hanging from a church steeple, his parachute tangled, his throat cut by a German patrol. Their mother had received all 3 telegrams on the same day. The War Department's efficiency in delivering grief, as remarkable as its ability to create it. The 4th son, Private James Francis Ryan, was somewhere in Normandy with the 101st Airborne, and the president himself had decided that the Ryan family had sacrificed enough. The assignment should have gone to a more senior officer, someone with connections and political aspirations who could parlay a successful rescue into post-war opportunities. That it went to Barris was a confluence of factors that included the unexpected casualties among the officer corps, the need for someone expendable if the mission failed, and perhaps a subtle cruelty from those who hoped that sending a black officer on such a high-profile mission would result in an embarrassment that would justify their prejudices. They gave him 6 men and wished him luck with smiles that never reached their eyes. Carter Elias was voluntold rather than volunteered. His experience and cynicism deemed necessary to balance what the brass assumed would be Barris's incompetence. Otis was assigned because someone who spoke French and German might prove useful, though everyone suspected it was really because he was Jewish, and therefore almost as expendable as their black captain. The other 4 were men who had either irritated their superiors or had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when the selection was being made. They set out at dawn, a mismatched group united only by their orders and their shared suspicion that they were being sent to die for a symbolic gesture. The French countryside rolled past them in a blur of hedgerows and destroyed vehicles. The detritus of war scattered like toys abandoned by violent children. They moved mostly in silence, each man alone with his thoughts about mortality and meaning. It was at a field hospital 12 miles inland that everything began to change. The facility had been a monastery before the war, its ancient stones now sheltering the wounded instead of the faithful, though perhaps there was little difference between prayer and the desperate pleas of dying men. Barris had led them there, seeking information about airborne units in the area, hoping someone might have treated or at least seen Private Ryan. The head nurse emerged from a surgical tent, her uniform stained with blood that had already oxidized to the color of rust. When she pulled back her surgical mask, Otis saw the captain's entire body language shift, a subtle straightening that spoke of recognition and something deeper. Rosalind Turner stood there, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that could not quite contain the curls that escaped to frame her face. Her green eyes, which had been dulled by exhaustion and the endless parade of suffering, suddenly sharpened with an emotion that made the other men look away, feeling like intruders on something private. They had known each other before the war. That much was immediately obvious. Not just known, but there had been something between them, something that the racial laws and social conventions of 1940s America had forbidden from flourishing. She approached Barris with a professional demeanor that fooled no one, asking about his mission with a clinical detachment that was betrayed by the way her hand trembled slightly as she made notes on her clipboard. Later, while the men resupplied and Otis helped translate for French civilians who might have seen American paratroopers, Rosalind found Barris alone behind the monastery, standing in what had once been a meditation garden, but was now a temporary morgue. The dead lay in neat rows, awaiting burial, their faces covered but their boots visible, some still caked with Normandy sand. She stood beside him without speaking for a long moment, both of them contemplating the arithmetic of war, how it reduced human beings to numbers, statistics, acceptable losses. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of every boy she had been unable to save, every last letter home she had taken dictation for, every mother who would receive a telegram that began with the War Department's regrets. Their conversation was brief, constrained by the possibility of observation, and the impossibility of their situation. She told him about the wounded from the 101st who had passed through, about rumors of scattered units reforming near a town called Rommel. She gave him medical supplies they could not spare, and information that might save lives. But beneath the professional exchange was an undercurrent of something else. A history implied but never stated. A future that neither dared imagine. As she turned to leave, she paused, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture that in another time and place might have meant nothing but here carried the weight of revolution. She told him to be careful, that he did not need to prove anything to anyone, that to her he had always been exactly who he needed to be. Then she was gone, returning to her endless work of trying to hold bodies together while the world seemed determined to tear them apart. The journey to find Ryan became a descent into the arbitrary cruelty of war. They found a private with the right last name but the wrong first. A black soldier from Alabama who laughed bitterly when they explained their mission. They were saving a white boy from Iowa because his mother had already lost 3 sons, while his own mother in Montgomery would receive a telegram, and no one would ever consider her grief worthy of a rescue mission. Barris said nothing, but Otis saw something in the captain's eyes, a recognition of the truth in the soldier's words, and the weight of carrying out orders that reinforced the very system that oppressed him. They encountered a German patrol near a destroyed bridge, the engagement brief but vicious. Private Henderson, a farm boy from Tennessee who had made no secret of his contempt for taking orders from Barris, caught a burst of machine gun fire across his chest. He died calling for his mother, his blood soaking into French soil that had already absorbed so much. Barris held him as he died, whispered words of comfort that Henderson probably could not hear over the sound of his own drowning lungs. And when it was over, the captain closed the boy's eyes with the same gentleness he had shown to all the dead. It was Carter Elias who broke the silence afterward, as they were digging Henderson's grave with entrenching tools. The sergeant had been watching Barris throughout their journey, measuring him against every officer he had ever served under, and finding his preconceptions constantly challenged. Now, as dirt fell onto Henderson's wrapped body, Elias spoke the thought that had been forming since the beach. The sergeant said that his grandfather had fought in the Civil War, not for any noble cause, but because he had been drafted and had no choice. His grandfather had told him that war did not care about the color of a man's skin when it came time to die, that bullets were the ultimate equality, killing rich and poor, white and black, with the same indifference. Elias had not understood what that meant until now, watching Barris lead them with a competence that had nothing to do with race and everything to do with character. They found Ryan's unit, or what remained of it, defending a bridge at Rommel that connected 2 vital supply routes. The paratroopers had been ordered to hold until relieved. But relief was not coming, and everyone knew it. They were 30 men trying to do the job of a company, armed with salvaged weapons and running low on ammunition, facing a German force that grew larger with each reconnaissance report. Ryan himself was younger than Otis had expected, with the kind of face that would have looked at home on a Norman Rockwell magazine cover. When Barris explained the mission, that he had been ordered to return home because his 3 brothers were dead, Ryan's reaction was not what anyone expected. He refused to leave. Not out of heroism, but out of a simple moral equation, that he could not abandon the men who had become his brothers in combat, for the memory of brothers he could no longer save. The argument that followed was heated, but brief. Some of Barris's men wanted to force Ryan to return, to complete their mission, and be done with this insanity. Others understood Ryan's position, even if they did not agree with it. It was Barris who made the decision that would define them all. They would stay and help defend the bridge. When Elias asked why, expecting some speech about duty or orders, Barris simply said that sometimes a man had to choose between what he was ordered to do and what he knew was right, and that he had been making that choice his entire life. The battle came with the dawn, announced by the rumble of German armor that made the ground tremble like the footsteps of approaching giants. They had prepared as best they could, turning the town into a maze of improvised explosives and kill zones. But everyone knew that preparation could only do so much against tanks and superior numbers. Barris commanded the defense with a tactical brilliance that would later be studied at military academies, though his name would be mysteriously absent from many of the texts. He positioned men not where military doctrine suggested, but where psychology and observation told him they would be most effective. He gave Otis, terrified beyond measure but somehow still functional, responsibility for coordinating with the French resistance fighters who had appeared in the night like ghosts of vengeance. He used their limited resources with an economy that turned disadvantage into advantage, weakness into strength. The fighting was brutal and personal in the way that urban combat always is. Men died in doorways and alleys, behind overturned cars, and in the ruins of homes where families had once gathered for Sunday dinners. Carter Elias fought with the ferocity of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Not the abstract concepts of democracy or freedom, but the concrete reality of the men beside him. It was during the height of the battle, when German infantry had broken through their outer defenses and everything seemed lost, that Elias saw the tank bearing down on Otis. The young translator had frozen, his rifle hanging useless in his hands, his mind unable to process the approaching death. Elias did not think, merely acted, shoving Otis aside and firing his Thompson submachine gun at the tank's vision ports in a futile gesture of defiance. The explosion knocked Barris off his feet, the heat washing over him like a preview of hell. When the smoke cleared, Elias was dying, his body broken but his eyes still alert. Barris crawled to him through the rubble, ignoring the battle still raging around them, and cradled the sergeant's head in his lap. Elias tried to speak, blood frothing from his mouth, but his eyes said everything. He had found his cause, his reason, his moment of clarity in the chaos of war. He died with something approaching peace on his face, and Barris felt the weight of that sacrifice settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. The battle turned when American artillery finally ranged in on the German positions, the shells falling like hammers of God, turning attacking tanks into funeral pyres. But victory, such as it was, came at a price that made the word itself seem obscene. Of the 30 defenders, fewer than 10 could still stand. The bridge held. The supply lines remained open. And somewhere in Washington, men who had never heard a shot fired in anger would congratulate themselves on strategic success. Ryan had survived, though he bore a shrapnel wound that would leave him with a permanent limp. He was helping treat the wounded when the German sniper's bullet found Barris. The captain had been directing the collection of casualties, standing in the open because someone had to. When the shot took him high in the chest, he fell backward, his body suddenly heavy with the weight of mortality. And Ryan was there, pressing his hands against the wound, trying to hold in life that was determined to escape. Barris spoke to Ryan in those final moments, his voice steady despite the blood frothing from his lungs. He did not speak of glory or patriotism or any of the abstractions that men use to justify war. Instead, he told Ryan about responsibility, about the weight of surviving when others did not, about the obligation to live a life that justified the sacrifice of those who had died for him. He made Ryan promise to live with purpose, to make his life matter not in grand gestures but in daily choices, in the way he treated others, in the love he showed his family, in the kindness he extended to strangers. Rosalind arrived with the medical convoy, having abandoned her post when she heard about the battle at Ramel. She found Barris still alive but fading, his breathing shallow and labored. The other medics tried to pull her away, to direct her to casualties who might still be saved, but she knelt beside him with a finality that brooked no argument. What passed between them in those final moments remained private, witnessed only by Ryan, who stood guard over them like a sentinel. She held Barris's hand against her heart, letting him feel its rhythm, the steady beat that would continue after his stopped. She whispered words that no one else could hear, words that crossed the boundaries of race and propriety and found their truth in the democracy of death. When his breathing stopped, she remained there for a long moment, her tears falling onto his still face, each drop a rebellion against the world that had kept them apart. They buried him in the American cemetery at Normandy, one cross among thousands, though his was one of the few that bore the name of a black officer. The official records would minimize his role, attribute the successful defense of Ramel to other officers who had not been there, but the men who survived knew the truth. They would tell their children and grandchildren about Captain Clinton Barris, about the leader who had shown them that courage had no color, that leadership was about service rather than privilege, that a man should be judged by his actions rather than the circumstances of his birth. Ryan returned to Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and built a hardware business that employed half the town. He never spoke publicly about the war, never joined the veterans organizations that would have welcomed him as a hero, but every year on June 6th, he would close the store and drive to the small cemetery outside town, where he had erected a memorial stone, not to his brothers who were buried elsewhere, but to the men who had died saving him. The years passed with the relentless momentum of time. The war became history, then legend, than something that young people learned about in school, with the same detachment they might study the Peloponnesian Wars that Barris had once taught. The men who had been there grew old and began to die, taking their memories with them, leaving only the sanitized version that appeared in textbooks and memorial speeches. Otis Duane became a rabbi, dedicating his life to building bridges between communities, teaching tolerance and understanding to generations who could not imagine the hatred that had once seemed so normal. He wrote a memoir that no publisher would touch because it challenged too many comfortable narratives about the war. In it, he described Barris not as a symbol or a pioneer, but as a man who had shown him what it meant to live with dignity in an undignified world. The civil rights movement came and went. Laws changed, schools integrated, and America told itself that it had overcome its past. But Ryan knew better. He had seen what it cost for a black man to lead in a white world, had witnessed the double burden that Barris had carried, fighting both the enemy in front of him and the prejudice behind him. When his own children asked him about the war, he told them about Barris, about the captain who had saved his life not once but twice, first from German bullets and then from a life that might have been lived without meaning. It was only when Ryan reached his 80s, when most of the men who had been there were gone, that he decided to make the pilgrimage to Normandy. His wife, patient and understanding through 57 years of marriage, accompanied him, knowing without being told that this was something he needed to do before his own time came. The cemetery was exactly as he had imagined it, rows of white crosses stretching toward the horizon, each one a story ended too soon. He found Barris's grave after an hour of searching, the grass around it as carefully maintained as all the others, no indication of the extraordinary man who lay beneath, except for the name and dates that marked the boundaries of his life. Ryan knelt with difficulty, his knees protesting the position, and placed the medal on the headstone. It was his own silver star, awarded for the defense of Rommel. But he had always known it belonged more to Barris than to himself. He had carried it for 60 years, waiting for this moment, for the chance to return something that had never really been his. His wife stood beside him, understanding without explanation the debt that was being paid, the circle that was being closed. She had lived with the ghost of Clinton Barris for their entire marriage, had seen his influence in the way Ryan treated everyone with dignity regardless of their station, in the way he had raised their children to see beyond surface differences, in the quiet acts of courage that had defined their life together. Ryan spoke to the headstone as if Barris could hear him, telling him about the life he had lived, the family he had raised, the business he had built that had given opportunities to people who might otherwise have had none. He spoke about the changes in America, the progress that had been made, and the distance still to travel. He asked the question that had haunted him for decades, whether he had lived a life that justified the sacrifice of those who had died for him. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees that bordered the cemetery, and for a moment Ryan could almost imagine it was Barris's voice, telling him what he had always known but needed to hear, that living with purpose was not about grand gestures, but about daily choices. That meaning came not from being saved, but from what one did with that salvation, that the highest honor one could pay to the dead was to live fully, completely, without reservation or regret. As they walked back toward the entrance, Ryan turned for one last look at the grave. The medal caught the afternoon sun, sending a brief flash of light across the manicured lawn, like a signal, like a farewell, like a benediction. He knew he would never return, that this pilgrimage was complete. But he also knew that he would carry Barris with him for whatever time remained. The cemetery faded behind them, but the memory remained sharp and clear. An old man had come to pay a debt and found instead that the ledger had always been balanced. The sacrifice had been freely given, the life had been fully lived, and the story, though it would never appear in the official histories, would continue in the lives of those who had been touched by it. Back in Iowa, in the small office behind his hardware store, Ryan kept a photograph that no one else had ever seen. It had been taken by a combat photographer in the ruins of Rommel, showing Barris standing amid the destruction, his uniform torn and dirty, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes still holding that quality that had made men follow him into hell. It was not the image of a symbol or a pioneer or a breakthrough. It was simply a man who had done his duty in a time when duty meant everything and nothing, who had led not because he was allowed to, but because he had to, who had died not for country or cause, but for the men beside him. The photograph would be found after Ryan's death, carefully preserved in an envelope, marked with a single word in his shaking handwriting. The word was teacher. and his children would puzzle over it, not understanding that Barris had been the greatest educator Ryan had ever known. Teaching through example, the only lesson that truly mattered. That in the end, when all the flags had been folded and all the speeches had been made, what remained was how one human being treated another in the crucible of extremity. History would eventually acknowledge Clinton Barris, decades too late, and with qualifications that diminished his accomplishments even as they recognized them. There would be documentaries and academic papers, arguments about his significance, and debates about his legacy. But for the men who had been there, who had seen him lead and fight and die, there was no debate. He had been their captain, their leader, their brother in arms. He had shown them that the boundaries they had thought immutable were merely conventions, that courage transcended color, that leadership was about service rather than status. In the end, that was his victory, more complete than any battle won or bridge held. He had changed the men around him simply by being who he was, by refusing to be less than he was capable of being, by demonstrating through action rather than words what America claimed to be but had not yet become. His death had been one among thousands on those bloody days in 1944, but his life, brief as it was, had been a revolution fought one heart at a time, one mind changed, one prejudice overcome. The flag continued to fly over the cemetery at Normandy, snapping in the Atlantic wind that carried salt and memory in equal measure. Below it, Clinton Barris rested among his brothers in arms, no longer separated by the artificial barriers that had defined his life, finally equal in the democracy of death. But his true monument was not in stone or bronze or carefully tended grass. It was in the lives that had been changed, the children raised differently, the choices made with his example in mind. James Ryan lived another 3 years after his pilgrimage to Normandy, long enough to see his first great-grandchild born, long enough to tell the story one more time to a new generation. When he died, peacefully in his sleep on a Sunday morning in spring, his last words were not about his brothers or his family or his long life fully lived. They were words that only his wife understood, that connected back to a moment in French ruins when a dying captain had grabbed his hand with surprising strength and made him promise, "Live so it matters," Ryan whispered. And then he was gone, joining at last the men who had saved him, who had died for him, who had taught him that the measure of a life was not in its length but in its depth, not in what was taken but in what was given, not in the accidents of birth but in the choices of character. The circle was complete, the debt was paid, and somewhere, perhaps, Clinton Barris was finally at peace, knowing that his sacrifice had not been in vain, that the seed he had planted in those desperate days had grown and flourished, and would continue long after the last witness was gone, and only the story remained.